most terrifying character in Silent Hill. Silent Hill has never been shy about disturbing characters. Silent Hill 4 introduced Walter Sullivan, a deranged serial killer who became the main villain, and the hellish world he traps his victims in is enough to spook any player. What makes Walter compelling is that he isn't evil for the sake of being evil. He was abandoned by his parents at birth and raised in an orphanage run by a cult, the same cult responsible for the events in Silent Hill 1 and 3. The cult influenced and corrupted Walter's mind, showing him a ritual they claimed would reunite him with his mother. But this was a lie. They only told him it would reunite him with his mother because it would motivate him to carry out their twisted ceremony. Walter was so corrupted that he truly believed Room 302 was his mother. This backstory alone makes Walter one of the most terrifying villains in the franchise. But he's not the only disturbing figure who haunts these fog-covered streets. Claudia Wolf is deeply unsettling. She doesn't wear shoes and has no eyebrows, and she carries herself with the conviction of someone who believes suffering is holy. Vincent Smith is twisted in his own way, though he wasn't necessarily a villain. He tried to manipulate Heather into killing for him, and there's a scene between Heather and Vincent that is stuck with countless players. Vincent asks Heather if the things she's been killing look like monsters to her, then claims he's joking when she reacts with horror. But we all know everything in Silent Hill is unique to each person, and Vincent is clearly someone we can't trust. It leaves you wondering whether he was actually messing with you or telling a terrible truth. For me personally, there is one character in the franchise I find truly terrifying. It's a character that makes you question the very man you control. It's a character that reveals the truth James Sunderland is hiding from himself. And understanding why this character is so frightening requires us to look at how Team Silent introduced him, how they used writing, cinematography, environmental design, and Akira Yamaoka's haunting music to plant seeds of doubt in the player's mind. Before we go further, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive, hit that like button to help other fans discover this video. Let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing our late night crew check in from all corners of the globe. So get comfortable, turn down the lights, and let's begin. This character is Eddie Dombrowski. Not a villain, exactly, but a victim of Silent Hill. And to understand why Eddie is so terrifying, we need to understand how the game presents him to us and what he represents in James Sunderland's psychological journey. James has his own reason for being in Silent Hill, though that reason raises immediate questions. He came to this town after receiving a letter from his deceased wife Mary, who has supposedly been dead for 3 years. Even James acknowledges the whole thing sounds ridiculous, but despite that, he came anyway. He's clinging to the hope of seeing his wife again, which leads us to believe James is a good person. We see him as the hero of the game. As we venture through the town, we quickly discover it's filled with grotesque monsters and roads destroyed beyond passage, making it impossible to reach the park where James believes Mary is waiting. We're forced to cut through the Blue Creek apartments, and it's in this building that we first encounter Pyramid Head. Whatever this thing is, it slowly pursues James throughout the game, an executioner that seems to exist solely to punish him. As we continue through this creepy building, we eventually enter a room where our ears are filled with a disgusting noise. The music is unsettling, keeping the tension high as we move around. Then we discover something horrifying, a body shoved inside a refrigerator like someone's trying to hide it. When James interacts with it, he wonders aloud who could have possibly done this. The noise coming from the bathroom may give us some answers. We open the door and see a man hunched over a toilet, vomiting. He looks over his shoulder at James, but watches his eyes carefully. He instantly looks away, avoiding eye contact. Avoiding eye contact is usually a sign of guilt or someone trying to hide something. This is something James himself did in a previous cutscene with Angela Roscoe. When Angela asked James who he's looking for, he avoided eye contact and even placed his hand over his face, fumbling his words because he doesn't want to tell a stranger that he's looking for his wife who died 3 years ago. Eddie immediately starts pleading innocence, even before James has spoken a single word. He claims he didn't do it, that the body was like this when he got here. He's obviously talking about the corpse in the fridge. This is already suspicious enough, but maybe we can give him the benefit of the doubt since there are bodies scattered throughout Silent Hill. James asks who the dead guy in the fridge is anyway, and Eddie persists, insisting he had nothing to do with it. It may be the reason he's in the bathroom being sick, possibly due to shock. James asks Eddie if he's friends with the red pyramid thing, which is an odd question, but James and Eddie are in an extremely odd situation. Eddie responds that he has no idea what James is talking about, but he also claims he's been seeing some weird-looking monsters. Maybe the very same monsters we've been encountering. Eddie tells James that he's not even from this town. James relates to him, saying something brought him here too. Before James leaves, Eddie turns to him and starts to say something but hesitates. He just tells James to be careful. This interaction is friendly but deeply awkward. Players may walk away from this feeling conflicted. Did Eddie do this, or was it the monsters? But there are other signs that give us a message. The camera angles throughout this cutscene are deliberate and meaningful. For most of the scene, the camera hangs over both James and Eddie. James stands over Eddie, which is a camera technique used to give a sense of dominance over someone else. Eddie is incredibly vulnerable here. He has his back completely exposed to a stranger in a potentially dangerous scenario. It shows the audience signs of weakness. James standing over Eddie reinforces that power dynamic. Even the dialogue reinforces Eddie's desperation. He pleads innocence to a crime that no one has accused him of yet. This gives off a sense of desperation. So far, this cutscene makes Eddie look weak, vulnerable, and even kind of pathetic. Maybe he is innocent, but the body did look like someone was trying to hide it in a refrigerator of all places, right next door to Eddie. You can actually find a room nearby with high detail images on the wall. There are beauty posters, football posters, even a football on the floor. You can also see stickers that say things like club and references to an inflexible person. If you understand the lore of Silent Hill, you'll know why this room exists and the messages it's trying to convey. The fact that this room is right beside Eddie allows you to piece together what it means. But there's one more thing to take note of during this cutscene, and that's the music. The music in the background is called Ordinary Vanity, and it starts off kind of peaceful and somewhat sympathetic, but it quickly transitions into something that sounds disturbing and sinister. Akira Yamaoka's music is designed to evoke emotions in the player. The soundtrack alone could be considered another character in this game. It's a vital part of the experience. The main emotions Yamaoka wants to evoke are sadness and fear, but the music isn't just background noise, it's a message. During the scary parts of the game, the music can get chaotic to the point where it doesn't even sound like music anymore. It's just noise. And in those moments, you'll notice a very common sound, banging, specifically banging on metal. This is a message to the player that there's danger nearby or right in front of them. This most commonly happens in areas when monsters are close, but it can also happen in some of the most oppressive locations in the game, like the hospital and prison sections. The ambient music there is telling you that the place you're in is extremely dangerous. Now back to Eddie. As the music transitions, you eventually hear the banging. This is the game sending you a message. Eddie may seem harmless, but there's something sinister going on. This entire encounter plants a seed in the player's mind. Is Eddie dangerous or not? Once you leave the apartments, you eventually run into a woman who oddly enough looks like James's wife, but her name is Maria. This confuses James deeply, and he even tells her they could be twins. Maria reassures him that he's confusing her with someone else. How odd. Maria tags along with us, and we stumble upon an abandoned bowling alley. Once we're inside, we're greeted with a cutscene. Eddie is there with Laura, a young girl, and the conversation just makes Eddie look even more suspicious. Laura questions him about what he's done and why he's running from the cops. Eddie brushes it off, saying he hasn't done anything bad. He claims he has no idea what the cops are doing and only ran away because he was scared. The music in this section is unlike anything else we hear in the game besides the music in Heaven's Night. It's very upbeat and catchy, a complete stark difference to the music in the previous cutscene with Eddie. Before we talk to Eddie, it's probably best to address the elephant in the room. Yes, Eddie somehow has pizza, not one, but two pizzas, in a town that's been completely overrun by monsters. This bowling alley is clearly abandoned. This cutscene is probably the most bizarre one in the franchise and has been memed quite extensively. Just listen to the dialogue. James says, "This town is full of monsters. How can you sit there and eat pizza?" Eddie responds that Laura said she was fine by herself, that a fat slob like him would just slow her down. Fun fact, even Guy Seehee, the voice actor for James, thought this entire scene was ridiculous. He even suggested to the developers that they should change some of the lines, but the directors knew what they wanted. They let the actors argue or challenge certain lines, but ultimately, if they really wanted something, they got it. Guy Seehee was against doing the dog ending and thought the line about eating pizza while monsters roamed was silly at the time, but it turns out it's a fan favorite, which shows what he knows. As an actor, I can understand why you would think something like this is ridiculous and even out of place for a game like Silent Hill. He's not wrong, but from a player's perspective, I think this entire scene was done on purpose. It's supposed to be ridiculous. It's not meant to be taken seriously at all because it fits Eddie's character. But notice the camera angles again in this cutscene. Eddie once again is sitting down, and James is standing over him. Some camera shots even hang over them both. It's yet again trying to give off the sense of dominance. Eddie is once again exposing his back to a stranger and is too distracted with pizza while James berates him for it. It's shown to us again that Eddie is weak and lazy. It's the game trying to tell us that Eddie's not a threat to James. This scene with the pizza may actually remove that seed of doubt from your mind that Eddie is a dangerous person. It may even make you forget about your last encounter with Eddie. But here's the thing. The whole scene with the pizza is a trick. It leads players into a false sense of security. Obviously, you're in a town full of monsters, so there's no real security in that. But at least you can ease your mind about potentially running into someone dangerous, right? Wrong. The next section of the game takes place inside Brookhaven Hospital, and it's where we eventually catch up with Laura. She contradicts James's timeline from the beginning of the game. She tells James that she was friends with Mary and that they met at the hospital last year. James tells us Mary died 3 years ago, but Laura tells James that she became friends with Mary last year. James shouts "liar" at Laura and says it's not possible because last year Mary was already, but before he finishes his sentence, he pauses. He's thinking to himself, or he doesn't want to tell Laura that Mary is dead. Either way, this part of the game tells us that James is an unreliable narrator. Before we leave the hospital, we're chased by Pyramid Head, and it's where Maria gets killed. This leaves James devastated. As we leave the hospital, James says to himself, "Mary, what should I do? Are you really waiting for me somewhere, or is this your way of taking And he stops. He doesn't finish his sentence. This is where James starts becoming incredibly suspicious. Before leaving the hospital, this message was left for James. He who is not bold enough to be stared at from across the abyss is not bold enough to stare into it himself. The truth can only be learned by marching forward. So we march forward and come across a dark hole in the wall. The stairs down feel endless, and reaching the end, we somehow find ourselves inside some sort of prison. This place feels like it shouldn't exist. As to why James is down here, well, someone may give us some answers. We jump down a pit and find ourselves in a dark hall. The music is incredibly unsettling. James looks around with his flashlight and sees something he wasn't expecting. Eddie is standing over a corpse with a revolver in his hand. Killing a person ain't no big deal, Eddie says. Just put the gun to their head. Pow! James asks Eddie if he killed him. Eddie immediately says it wasn't his fault. He made me do it. James tells Eddie to calm down and explain what happened. Eddie says the guy had it coming. I didn't do anything. He just came after me. Besides, he was making fun of me with his eyes just like that other one. Is Eddie talking about the person in the fridge? Or has he killed someone else entirely? Just like that other one, James ridicules Eddie for his actions, and this sets Eddie off. What do you mean, just for that? Eddie, you can't just kill someone because of the way they looked at you. Eddie responds, Oh yeah, why not? Till now, I always let people walk all over me, just like that stupid dog. He had it coming too. For the first time, we see Eddie stand. This causes James to step back. This visibly shakes him. Eddie and James are now on the same level. This time, James doesn't look dominant and actually looks scared. Eddie is not the same person here. This could be the real Eddie that he was hiding from James. The eye contact in this cutscene is very important because we can clearly see in Eddie's eyes that he's lost it. The eye animations were a really important part of Eddie's character, done on purpose to show the player that Eddie is deranged. Eye direction is another layer of direction. Eddie's eyes move a little faster compared to other characters. This was done deliberately. Even James's eye animations here are done perfectly. At one point, we can clearly see James looking down at Eddie's gun, but he quickly brings his eyes back up to match Eddie's. James is probably worried for his own life here since Eddie is incredibly unpredictable at this point. Just moments ago, he was eating pizza without a care in the world, and James ridiculed him for it. The game showed us that Eddie is weak and harmless, maybe even incapable of killing. After Eddie lets out all his frustrations, he then tells James he was just joking, which in itself is twisted, but you can clearly see in his face that this was another lie. Just like the first time we met Eddie, he avoided eye contact before he started to plead innocence. Now he's avoiding eye contact after he just said it was all a joke. He's lying. But notice how he never took his eyes off James during his venting. Eddie maintained eye contact because he wasn't lying during that moment. This time, Eddie was telling the truth about his rage and his murders. Eddie eventually leaves, and we're left with a lot of questions. But not just questions about Eddie, also questions about James. The place we're in is clearly a prison. Down here, it's filled with evil and danger. This is probably the most oppressive area in the entire game, and the music reinforces that. It's not even music at this point, it's just noise. Specifically loud banging and metallic sounds, which we all know is a message of danger. But the question is, if Eddie's down here, then why is James here? The whole scene with the pizza is what makes this cut scene even more terrifying, because we saw two very different Eddies, but we don't know which one is the real Eddie since he's obviously a liar. We can inspect the body, and James spots several bullet holes. Eddie has killed this man here in Silent Hill, but what's crucial to understand is that before coming to Silent Hill, Eddie hadn't actually murdered anyone. He shot a football player in the leg and killed a dog, but he didn't kill a person. The town has pushed him over the edge, transforming someone who committed lesser crimes into an actual killer. However, we don't know this yet, and the way Eddie has been written makes us uncertain about what he's truly capable of. It makes the player feel conflicted about him, not sure whether he's innocent or not. And when you finally get your answer, it's terrifying because Eddie could have always been like this, or the town has corrupted him so much that it pushed him to his boiling point. Now he's down here with us carrying a gun. The whole prison section is very oppressive, and we see James jump down many holes. It's clearly symbolic of James's descent into madness. It's where players may start to realize that it seems like this whole journey for James has been a punishment for something he's done. We've been given hints leading up to this point in the game, and it seems like James isn't as innocent as someone like Eddie, and now we're stuck down here with him. At the end of the labyrinth section, we can find a graveyard. You can't read most of the tombstones, but there are 3 in the corner that we can read. We can find the tombstones of Angela, Eddie, and even James. The graves are empty, but this is a sign that whatever these characters have done, they all deserve equal punishment. It isn't long before we run into Eddie one last time. This time we find him in a room with multiple bodies, and this time he's completely lost his mind. "What does it look like?" Eddie says. "He always busted my balls. You fat, disgusting piece of shit. You make me sick, fat ass. You're nothing but a waste of skin. You're so ugly, even your mama don't love you." Well, maybe he was right. Maybe I am nothing but a fat, disgusting piece of shit. But you know what? It doesn't matter if you're smart, dumb, ugly, pretty. It's all the same once you're dead, and a corpse can't laugh. In this cutscene, he isn't just venting, he's letting out all of his pent-up rage. The camera angles constantly shift, making Eddie's next move that much more unpredictable. One detail worth pointing out in this cutscene is the music. In the last cutscene, the sounds of banging were completely absent, and so far it's also been absent here as well. Not until Eddie finishes his last sentence before walking away. "Makes fun of me, I'll kill him," just like that. James, for some reason, felt the need to ask, "Eddie, have you gone nuts?" And this pushes Eddie completely over the edge. He turns to us and accuses James of laughing at him. "Hey, I didn't mean anything," James says. "Don't bother," Eddie responds. "I understand. You've been laughing at me all along, haven't you? Ever since we first met." Eddie proceeds to shoot James, which unfortunately transitions into a pretty laughable boss fight. It only takes a few shots to cause him to flee, which gives us an opportunity to look at the bodies of Eddie's victims a bit closer. You'll notice that all the bodies look like James. You can't see the faces that well, but they're all wearing the same clothes. This wasn't a reused asset, it was completely intentional. In fact, every body James sees is his own. This doesn't necessarily mean they aren't real, it's just what James sees. Everything James sees in Silent Hill is unique to him. When we run into Angela and save her from a monster, we see it as a disgusting creature, but Angela sees it as her father. Eddie probably sees ordinary people, but they're all laughing at him, which caused him to have a psychotic breakdown. We have to put an end to it. Entering the next room, Eddie has a lot to say, and it completely makes you rethink James as a whole. When you're hated, picked on, spit on, just because of the way you look, after you've been laughed at your whole freaking life. That's why I ran away, after I killed the dog. Ran away like a scared little girl. Yeah, I killed that dog. It was fun. It tried to chew its own guts out. Finally died all curled up in a ball. Then he came after me. I shot him too, right in the leg. He cried more than the dog. Eddie explains the reason why he came to Silent Hill. He killed the dog and shot the owner. The person he shot was a football player, most likely someone from his school or maybe even someone he played on the same team with. The room beside Eddie at the very beginning explains a lot now. It had football posters all over the wall and even potential messages about Eddie's insecurities. James says, "You think it's okay to kill people? You need help, Eddie." Eddie responds with something chilling. "Don't get all holy on me, James. This town called you too. You and me are the same. We're not like other people. Don't you know that?" What Eddie implies here is that he and James are there for the same reasons. They've both done something terrible, and now they're paying for it. The town called Eddie because of what he did. However, we only know that James is here because he received a letter from his dead wife, who apparently died 3 years ago. You and me are the same. We're not like other people. Don't you know that? Unfortunately, Eddie's boss fight is probably the worst in the franchise simply because of how goofy it looks. But the music in the background is extremely aggressive, and it's definitely fitting for this fight because now we see Eddie for what he is. The music just enhances all that pent-up rage he's been holding in. Silent Hill broke Eddie. It consumed him and made him give in to his bloodlust. And now James is forced to kill him. After the fight, James looks at Eddie's lifeless body and says, "Eddie, Eddie, I killed a human being, a human being." Carrying out this act of self-defense clearly shakes James. You can tell by his voice that he feels guilty for what he had to do. But it was either him or Eddie. James looks over Eddie's body and processes what he's just done. But as James repeats a human being to himself, it's almost like the feeling of taking someone's life feels familiar to him. "Mary, did you really die 3 years ago? We finally escaped the prison, and outside it's very ominous. We take a boat across the lake to get to the final section of the game, and I think this segment is brilliant simply because we have time to process everything we've been through up until this point. We reconsider everything we know about James as a person, and we are slowly becoming aware that James is not the hero of this story. He's hiding something dark from us, and now we fear what we might discover. This is why I love Eddie as a character, because he challenges what you think about James. He makes you question him on a deeper level. He makes you think about the horrors James may have committed and why he's here in the first place. Eddie makes the player face the possibility that James is hiding a lot from them and that everything we know is a lie. Walter Sullivan may be the scariest villain in the franchise because of the horrible murders he committed and the power he holds over his victims. But the difference between Walter and Eddie is that Eddie isn't a villain. He was just another victim of Silent Hill. Eddie's character psychologically messes with the player and leads them into a false sense of security. He's a character that opens the player's mind about James, the person who we thought was the hero of the story. Most of the horror that comes from Walter is mostly from shock value and the corrupted world he traps the player in. But the horror that comes from Eddie plays with your mind. James is not a good person. Mary did not die 3 years ago. She most likely died only days or weeks ago. But it wasn't due to her sickness. James murdered her. He took her life out of selfishness. He felt like she was a burden to him, and she was taking away his life. James loved her, but the sickness didn't just consume Mary, it was also consuming James. He lied to himself that he did it out of mercy, but the reality is he did it for himself. And now he's stuck in Silent Hill, paying for his sins. Pyramid Head was created from James's desire to be punished, but he doesn't know this until much later in the game. James became so delusional about what he did that he kept lying to himself. The purpose of Pyramid Head was to force James to confront his sins. The guilt James carries from killing Eddie does weigh on him. You can hear it in his voice when he says, "I killed a human being," and this act of violence helps break down his denial about what he did to Mary. The two pyramid heads that appear at the end of the game represent the duality of Mary's death, the death of who she was when illness took her, and the literal death when James suffocated her with a pillow. They embody James's guilt manifested twice over for the woman he killed. Eddie, in my opinion, is the character that exposes players to the truth about James. And for that reason, this is why I think Eddie Dombrowski is the most terrifying character in Silent Hill. But to truly understand why Eddie's role is so powerful, we need to examine how Silent Hill 2 uses its supporting characters as mirrors. Each person James encounters in the town reflects a different aspect of his psychological state, his guilt, and his journey toward either redemption or damnation. Eddie isn't just a random encounter. He's a carefully constructed narrative device that serves multiple purposes within the game's broader themes. Let's start by looking at the other characters James meets and what they represent. Angela Roscoe is a young woman fleeing from an abusive past. Her father sexually assaulted her, and she ultimately killed him in self-defense. When James encounters Angela throughout the game, her world is literally on fire. The environments she inhabits are consumed by flames, representing her trauma, her rage, and her inability to escape the psychological prison of her past. Angela's Silent Hill is different from James's because her guilt and trauma manifest differently. In one of the most haunting scenes in the game, James finds Angela on a burning staircase. She tells him that for her, the town is always like this, always burning. This moment is crucial because it reveals that Silent Hill is not one fixed reality, but a reflection of each visitor's internal state. Angela's hell is fire. James's hell is fog, rust, and manifestations of sexual guilt. Eddie's hell, as we'll explore, is filled with people who mock him, judge him, and laugh at him. When Angela ascends that burning staircase at the end of her final scene, walking directly into the flames, it's implied that she's chosen to end her suffering. James can't follow her. He can't save her. Their hells are separate, and her choice is her own. This scene devastates players because Angela was sympathetic. She was a victim. But even victims can be consumed by their trauma to the point where escape feels impossible. Then there's Laura, the 8-year-old girl who was friends with Mary during her final days in the hospital. Laura is immune to Silent Hill's horrors. She doesn't see the monsters. She doesn't experience the other world. She walks through the fog as if it's just a normal, slightly eerie town. Why? Because Laura carries no guilt. She's a child with no sins weighing on her conscience. She loved Mary genuinely and grieves her loss honestly, without the complicated layers of resentment, frustration, and ultimately violence that defined James's relationship with his dying wife. Laura's presence in the game serves as a constant reminder that Silent Hill only punishes those who deserve it. The town is selective. It doesn't randomly torture innocent people. It calls to those who carry guilt, who have unresolved trauma, who have committed acts they can't forgive themselves for. Laura can walk freely because she has nothing to atone for. Maria is perhaps the most complex character, aside from James himself. She's a manifestation created by Silent Hill specifically for James. She looks almost exactly like Mary, but dresses provocatively and behaves in a more sexual, flirtatious manner. Maria represents what James wishes Mary could have been during her illness: healthy, desirable, available. She's a cruel gift from the town, dangling the possibility of having Mary back without the guilt, without the sickness, without the burden. But Maria dies repeatedly throughout the game. Pyramid Head kills her in the hospital. She's executed again in the hotel. Each death forces James to confront loss over and over again, punishing him for his desire to replace Mary rather than mourn her properly. Maria's resurrections create confusion. Is this the same Maria or a new one? Does she remember dying? The ambiguity is intentional. Maria exists in a liminal space between being a person and being a psychological construct, and that uncertainty mirrors James's own fractured grasp on reality. In some endings, if James focuses too much on Maria, if he shows too much care for her and prioritizes her safety over confronting his guilt, he leaves Silent Hill with Maria instead of accepting the truth about Mary. But even in that ending, there are hints that the cycle will repeat. Maria coughs, suggesting she'll develop the same illness Mary had, and James will be trapped in the same nightmare all over again. It's a false escape, a continuation of denial rather than genuine resolution. Now let's return to Eddie and examine why his role is so crucial in this constellation of mirror characters. Eddie represents the path James could have taken if his guilt had manifested differently. Instead of internalizing his crime and spiraling into depressive delusion like James, Eddie externalized his pain and became openly violent. Eddie was bullied his entire life for his weight, his appearance, his perceived weakness. He was mocked, degraded, and made to feel subhuman. Eventually, he snapped. He killed a dog belonging to one of his tormentors. Then he shot a football player who had bullied him. Then he fled to Silent Hill, where the town amplified his rage and paranoia until he saw enemies everywhere. Eddie's journey is a descent into justified violence that becomes unjustified madness. At first, you might sympathize with him. Bullying is cruel. Being tormented for years would drive anyone to desperate acts. But as the game progresses, Eddie's justifications become thinner and thinner. By the time we reach the final confrontation, he's killing people simply because they looked at him wrong, because he imagined mockery in their eyes. The brilliance of Eddie's character is that Team Silent makes you complicit in his downfall. Think about your interactions with him. In the apartment bathroom, James, and by extension the player, is suspicious of Eddie. We don't openly accuse him, but our body language, our questions, our wariness all communicate distrust. At the bowling alley, James berates Eddie for eating pizza while monsters roam outside. It's a moment that seems absurd and humorous on the surface, but it's also James judging Eddie, looking down on him, treating him as pathetic and weak. These interactions plant seeds. Eddie feels judged by James because he is being judged. And in Silent Hill, where perception shapes reality, that judgment has weight. By the time we reach the prison and Eddie is standing over a corpse, he explicitly tells James, "You've been laughing at me all along, haven't you? Ever since we first met." Has James been laughing? Not literally. But has he been looking down on Eddie, dismissing him, treating him as lesser? Absolutely, and that treatment mirrors the bullying Eddie experienced his entire life. In this moment, James becomes one of Eddie's tormentors, and Eddie responds the only way he knows how, with violence. The boss fight against Eddie is tragic because it's avoidable in narrative terms, even if it's mandatory in gameplay terms. If James had shown empathy, if he treated Eddie as an equal rather than as a weak, suspicious figure, would things have ended differently? The game suggests maybe, but James is too wrapped up in his own guilt and mission to extend that empathy. He's hunting for Mary, confronting his own demons, and Eddie is just an obstacle, a complication, another strange element of this nightmarish town. When James kills Eddie and says, "I killed a human being," the weight of that statement is enormous. Up until this point, James has been killing monsters, grotesque creatures that represent his guilt, his sexual frustration, his psychological torment. But Eddie was a person, a disturbed, violent person by the end, but still human. And killing him forces James to cross a line he hadn't consciously crossed before in the game. Except he had crossed that line before. He'd crossed it when he suffocated Mary with a pillow. Eddie's death is James's rehearsal for confronting the truth about Mary's death, the guilt he feels, the horror of taking a human life, the justifications he immediately starts constructing. It was self-defense. He was going to kill me. I had no choice. All of this mirrors the rationalizations he's been making about Mary. She was suffering. It was an act of mercy. She would have wanted this. But were those rationalizations true, or were they convenient lies James told himself to avoid facing the selfish reality that he killed Mary because he couldn't stand being her caretaker anymore, because her illness had become a burden, because he wanted his life back? Eddie forces James to confront the gap between justified violence and murder, and in doing so, Eddie forces the player to question everything they've assumed about James. This is why Eddie is the most terrifying character in Silent Hill 2. Not because he's a serial killer, though he becomes one. Not because he's physically threatening, though the boss fight is dangerous. Eddie is terrifying because he's a mirror that shows us who James really is. Let's talk about the environmental storytelling around Eddie's character, because Team Silent embedded clues about Eddie throughout the game that most players might miss on a first playthrough. The room next to the apartment bathroom where you first meet Eddie contains very specific details. There are football posters on the walls, football equipment scattered on the floor, and stickers referencing rigidity and inflexibility. This room doesn't belong to Eddie, but it represents his trauma. It's a recreation of the space inhabited by one of his bullies, likely the football player Eddie shot. Silent Hill generates this environment to surround Eddie with reminders of his victimization and his crime. The fact that this room exists right next to where Eddie is having a breakdown is no accident. The town is taunting him, reminding him of what was done to him and what he did in response. It's the same mechanism that creates nurses in the hospital for James. Manifestations drawn from trauma and guilt, made physical and unavoidable. Later, in the prison section, the meat locker where Eddie's final boss fight takes place is deliberately designed. It's a freezer, a cold, dead space where meat is stored and processed. Corpses hang on hooks. Everything is frozen, preserved, lifeless. This environment represents Eddie's psychological state. By the end of his journey, he's frozen emotionally, unable to process his pain in any healthy way. He's become cold, dead inside, treating human life as just meat to be disposed of. The corpses in the freezer all look like James. This detail is crucial and often debated among fans. Some interpret it as Silent Hill showing James his potential fate. If he doesn't confront his guilt, he'll end up like these bodies, just another corpse hanging in the cold. Others interpret it as evidence that Eddie's perception of reality has become completely distorted. He's seeing James everywhere because James represents judgment, and Eddie is now so paranoid that every person looks like an enemy. What's particularly tragic is that these bodies represent Eddie's descent into actual murder, crimes he's committing in Silent Hill itself, pushed to this extreme by the town's ability to amplify guilt and rage into their worst possible forms. Both interpretations are valid and highlight the genius of Silent Hill 2's ambiguity. The game refuses to give you one definitive answer. It presents symbolic imagery and trusts players to interpret it through the lens of their own understanding and experience. The music during Eddie's encounters deserves special attention. As mentioned earlier, Ordinary Vanity plays during the first meeting in the apartment bathroom. The track begins with melancholy, almost sympathetic tones, as if the game wants you to feel sorry for Eddie. But as the conversation progresses, the music shifts, introducing dissonant elements, and eventually the ominous metallic banging that signals danger throughout the game. This musical shift mirrors the player's shifting perception of Eddie. At first he seems pathetic and harmless. By the end of the scene, doubt has crept in. The music guides this emotional journey, subtly manipulating how you feel about the character without you consciously realizing it. During the bowling alley scene, the music is completely different, upbeat, almost jovial, with a melody that feels out of place in a horror game. This tonal whiplash is intentional. It lulls you into a false sense of security, making you think maybe Eddie is just a harmless, somewhat dim guy who happens to be in the wrong place. The absurdity of the pizza, the casual conversation with Laura, the almost comedic tone, all of it works to erase the suspicion planted in the first encounter. Then, in the prison, the music becomes oppressive. There's no melody anymore, just industrial noise, grinding metal, and that persistent banging that signals mortal danger. The soundscape tells you before Eddie even speaks that this encounter will be different. This is where the mask comes off. This is where the real Eddie, or perhaps the Eddie that Silent Hill has created through amplifying his worst impulses, finally emerges. During the boss fight, the music is aggressive and chaotic, filled with rage and desperation. It's not heroic or epic like a typical video game boss theme. It's ugly and uncomfortable, reflecting the ugliness of the situation. You're not fighting a monster, you're fighting a broken human being who's become monstrous. There's no glory in this fight, no satisfaction in winning. It's just sad and necessary and deeply unsettling. Akira Yamaoka understood that music in Silent Hill should evoke complex emotions, not simple ones. Eddie's musical themes capture sympathy, suspicion, false security, dread, and tragic inevitability all across different encounters. The music is telling a story parallel to the visual and narrative story, and all three layers work together to create one of the most psychologically complex character arcs in gaming. Let's examine the cinematography and camera work in Eddie's scenes more closely, because the visual language is doing as much work as the dialogue. In the first bathroom encounter, the camera is positioned above and behind James, looking down at Eddie. This high-angle shot makes Eddie appear small, weak, and vulnerable. We're looking at him from a position of power and judgment. But notice that Eddie's back is to us for much of the scene. In film language, showing a character's back suggests they're hiding something or that they're vulnerable and exposed. Eddie is both. He's hiding his guilt about the body in the fridge, but he's also genuinely vulnerable in this moment, sick and frightened and alone. James stands in the doorway, silhouetted, with his flashlight pointing at Eddie like an interrogation spotlight. The framing is accusatory, even though James hasn't accused Eddie of anything yet. The visual composition is doing the accusing for him. At the bowling alley, the camera angles shift. Eddie is still sitting while James stands, maintaining that vertical power dynamic. But the shots are more neutral, more conversational. The camera occasionally goes to Eddie's eye level, allowing us to see his perspective for brief moments. This creates a temporary equality, suggesting that maybe Eddie isn't a threat after all. Maybe he's just another lost soul trying to survive this nightmare. But even here, there are subtle warnings. Eddie's eyes don't quite meet James's gaze consistently. He looks away, looks down, looks at his pizza, anywhere but directly at James for prolonged periods. This avoidance suggests deception or shame or both. The camera captures these small behaviors, allowing observant players to pick up on the tells. In the prison hallway encounter, the cinematography becomes more dynamic and unsettling. The camera angle shifts multiple times during the conversation, creating visual instability. We see James from the side, Eddie from below, then both from a high angle, then a close-up of Eddie's face. This constant shifting prevents the viewer from getting comfortable, mirroring the tension and unpredictability of the conversation. When Eddie stands up and confronts James directly, the camera positions them at equal height for the first time. Eddie is no longer below James's level. They're face to face, eye to eye. This visual equality signals that the power dynamic has shifted. Eddie is no longer the pathetic, vulnerable figure from earlier scenes. He's now a legitimate threat. The close-ups on Eddie's eyes during this scene are particularly effective. His pupils are wide, his gaze is intense, and his eyes dart rapidly as he speaks. These are signs of psychological instability, of someone on the edge of violence. The animation team deliberately made Eddie's eye movements faster and more erratic than other characters to communicate his mental state without needing dialogue to spell it out. When Eddie claims he was just joking and averts his gaze, the camera lingers on his face. We see the lie clearly. His words say one thing, but his expression and body language say another. The camera is giving us the truth that Eddie's dialogue is trying to hide. In the final boss fight, the camera work becomes even more interesting. The meat locker is a large open space, but the camera often frames it in claustrophobic ways, using close angles and tight shots that make the space feel smaller and more oppressive. When Eddie rants about his crimes, killing the dog, shooting the bully, the camera does slow push-ins on his face, emphasizing his words and forcing us to confront the reality of what he's become. The corpses hanging in the freezer are framed deliberately in several shots. They're always visible in the background, silent witnesses to the violence Eddie has committed. The camera occasionally cuts to these bodies, drawing our attention to them, making sure we register that these aren't just environmental props, they're victims. And the fact that they all resemble James creates a visual echo that links Eddie's violence to James's own hidden crime. After James kills Eddie, the camera pulls back to a wide shot, showing Eddie's body lying in the snow and meat locker debris. James stands over him, no longer the dominant figure, but a shaken, guilty man. The framing isolates both characters, Eddie in death, James in the realization of what he's done. There's distance between them now, physical and metaphorical, but there's also a connection. They're both killers. They're both in Silent Hill for the same reason. The camera then slowly pushes in on James's face as he stammers, "I killed a human being. A human being." The repetition, captured in close-up, shows his horror, but also his recognition. The way he says it suggests he's remembering another time he said something similar, or felt something similar. The camera holds on his face just long enough for that realization to sink in for the player as well. This is masterful visual storytelling. The camera isn't just recording events, it's guiding our emotional and intellectual response, highlighting important details, creating visual metaphors, and reinforcing themes without a single word of dialogue. Now let's talk about what Eddie represents in terms of Silent Hill 2's broader themes about guilt, punishment, and the nature of evil. One of the central questions Silent Hill 2 asks is, what makes someone deserve punishment? The town functions as a kind of purgatory or hell specifically designed for each visitor. It manifests their guilt, forces them to confront their crimes, and ultimately delivers judgment. But the game is careful to show that not everyone's crimes are equal, and not everyone's judgment is the same. Angela killed her father, but it was in self-defense after years of sexual abuse. Does she deserve the burning hell she experiences? Many players would say no. She was a victim who fought back. Yet Silent Hill punishes her anyway, or perhaps, more accurately, she punishes herself. Her guilt isn't about the act of killing, but about everything surrounding it. The years of abuse she endured, the family dysfunction, the fact that part of her might have wanted him dead long before the actual act. Silent Hill manifests internal guilt, not external moral judgment. Eddie killed a dog and a person, then continued killing in Silent Hill itself. His initial crimes were reactions to bullying and cruelty. Does he deserve punishment? The answer is more complex than a simple yes or no. He was genuinely victimized, genuinely traumatized. His violence emerged from real pain. But does suffering justify murder? The game presents Eddie sympathetically at first, then gradually peels back layers to reveal someone who has crossed moral lines that can't be uncrossed. James killed his wife. He suffocated her with a pillow while she lay sick and helpless. Does he deserve punishment? He tells himself it was mercy that she was suffering, that it was an act of love, but the game slowly reveals the selfishness underlying that choice. Mary's letter, found at the end, shows that despite her suffering, she still loved him, still wanted to live, still had hope. James didn't kill her to end her suffering. He killed her to end his own. The genius of Silent Hill 2 is that it doesn't give you a clear moral hierarchy. It doesn't say Angela is innocent, Eddie is guilty, and James is somewhere in between. Instead, it shows you three people trapped by guilt, some deserved, some not, all consuming. And it asks you to sit with the discomfort of recognizing that victims can become perpetrators, that suffering doesn't excuse cruelty, and that the person you've been controlling for hours might be fundamentally irredeemable. Eddie serves as the clearest mirror for James because their journey shared dark parallels. Both came to Silent Hill carrying guilt, James for murdering his wife, Eddie for violent acts that stopped short of murder. But the crucial difference is that Silent Hill transformed Eddie into what he hadn't been before, an actual killer. James, by contrast, was already a murderer when he arrived. Eddie shows James what the town does to people who can't face their guilt. It makes them worse, pushes them further, until they become the monsters they feared they were. Both constructed justifications for their violence. Both fled to Silent Hill carrying guilt they couldn't face, and both experience the town as a place that forces them to confront what they've done. The difference is in how they respond to that confrontation. Eddie doubles down. He becomes more violent, more paranoid, more convinced that he's the victim and everyone else is the enemy. He refuses accountability and instead projects his self-hatred outward, seeing mockery and judgment in every face, responding with escalating violence. James, depending on how you play, can choose differently. He can face his guilt, accept responsibility, and seek some form of redemption or closure, or he can deny it, escape into fantasy with Maria, or succumb to despair and end his own life. The multiple endings reflect these different paths, and none of them are entirely happy because there's no way to undo murder. But some endings suggest the possibility of moving forward, of living with guilt rather than being destroyed by it. Eddie has no multiple endings. His path concludes with death. Either he kills James and the game ends, or James kills him and the story continues. This singularity suggests that Eddie represents the path of no return, the point at which guilt and violence have created a feedback loop that can only end in destruction. When Eddie tells James, "You and me are the same, we're not like other people," he's speaking a truth that James doesn't want to hear. They are the same in fundamental ways. Both are murderers. Both are in Silent Hill because the town called to their guilt. Both are experiencing personalized hells designed around their specific psychological wounds. But the statement also highlights a crucial difference. Eddie has accepted that he's not like other people. He's embraced his outsider status, his victimhood, and used it to justify continued violence. James hasn't fully accepted what he is yet. He's still in denial, still lying to himself, still clinging to the belief that he might be the hero of this story. Eddie's death forces James to let go of that belief. After killing Eddie, James can no longer pretend he's just a grieving husband looking for his deceased wife. He's a killer who just killed again. The blood on his hands is literal now, not just metaphorical. And that realization is what finally breaks through his delusions and allows the truth about Mary to surface. This is why Eddie is the most terrifying character in the game. Not because he's the most violent. Pyramid Head commits far more brutal acts. Not because he's the most sympathetic. Angela's suffering is more clearly unjust. Eddie is terrifying because he's the character who most directly confronts James and the player with uncomfortable truths about guilt, violence, and the thin line between victim and perpetrator. Let's consider the broader context of how Silent Hill 2 uses its supporting cast to construct a complete psychological portrait of guilt and trauma. Each character James meets represents a different response to unbearable circumstances. Angela represents internalized trauma and self-destruction. She's turned all her pain inward, burning herself alive in an endless loop of guilt and suffering even though she was the victim. Her Silent Hill is flames because that's how she feels inside, consumed, burning, destroyed by what was done to her and what she did in response. Laura represents innocence and the absence of guilt. She moves through Silent Hill untouched by its horrors because she has nothing to atone for. She's a reminder that the town's judgment is selective and targeted. Not everyone suffers here, only those who carry the weight of their actions. Maria represents temptation and denial. She's the easy way out, the fantasy that allows James to avoid confronting reality. She's what he wishes Mary could have been: healthy, sexual, available, uncomplicated. Choosing Maria in the ending represents James's failure to grow, his inability to face his guilt, his decision to repeat the cycle rather than break it. Eddie represents externalized rage and the progression from justified grievance to unjustified violence. Before Silent Hill, Eddie had committed serious crimes, shooting someone in the leg, killing a dog, but he hadn't crossed the line into murder. The town itself pushed him over that edge, amplifying his rage and paranoia until he became the killer he'd been accused of being. He's what happens when victimhood becomes identity, when pain becomes permission to hurt others, when someone who was genuinely wronged transforms into someone who wrongs others even more severely. And Pyramid Head, though not human, represents James's own desire for punishment. He's the executioner James believes he deserves, the judgment made flesh, the part of James that knows what he did was wrong and demands consequences. Together, these characters create a complete ecosystem of guilt. They're not just random encounters, they're aspects of James's psychology made external, symbolic representatives of different paths and choices, mirrors reflecting different facets of his fractured psyche. The brilliance of Team Silent's writing is that each of these characters functions on multiple levels simultaneously. They're literal people with their own stories. Angela really is a young woman fleeing abuse. Eddie really is a bullying victim who became violent. But they're also symbolic. Angela is guilt turned inward. Eddie is rage turned outward. And they're also psychological. They represent different aspects of James's mental state and different possible futures for him. This layered approach to character creates extraordinary depth. You can analyze Silent Hill 2 from a purely narrative perspective and find a compelling story about several broken people trapped in a nightmare town. Or you can analyze it from a symbolic perspective and find a rich psychological allegory about grief, guilt, and trauma. Or you can analyze it from a metatextual perspective and find commentary on player agency, moral judgment, and the nature of horror itself. All of these interpretations are valid because the game was constructed to support all of them simultaneously. This is what separates Silent Hill 2 from most other horror games. It's not just trying to scare you, or challenge you, or entertain you. It's trying to make you think, to make you feel uncomfortable, to make you question your assumptions about morality, guilt, and punishment. And Eddie is central to this project because he's the character who most directly challenges those assumptions. Think about your first playthrough of Silent Hill 2. Most players, when they first meet Eddie in that bathroom, feel suspicious of him. He's acting guilty, there's a body in the next room, the music is ominous. But he's also pathetic and vulnerable, so you're conflicted. You don't know whether to trust him or fear him. Then, at the bowling alley, he seems harmless. He's eating pizza, talking to a little girl, worrying about being a burden. The threat seems to have evaporated. You relax a little. Maybe Eddie's okay after all. Then, in the prison, everything changes. He's standing over a corpse with a gun. He admits to killing. He rants about his justifications. The threat is real and immediate. This progression manipulates your emotions and judgments. The game makes you sympathize with Eddie, then distrust him, then dismiss him as harmless, then fear him, then kill him. You're put through an emotional journey that mirrors James's own confusion and moral ambiguity. And after you kill Eddie, when James says, "I killed a human being," you feel that weight too, because Eddie wasn't just a boss to be defeated. He was a person, disturbed, violent, but still human. And you participated in his death. You pulled the trigger, even if it was in self-defense, even if the game gave you no choice. This is horror that goes beyond jump scares or grotesque imagery. This is horror that implicates you, that makes you complicit, that forces you to examine your own moral reasoning. Did Eddie deserve to die? Was there another way? Is James a hero for stopping a killer, or just another killer who happened to win the confrontation? The game doesn't answer these questions, it just asks them and lets you sit with the discomfort. Now, let's talk about a crucial detail that many players miss: the symbolism of Eddie's weapon and what it represents. Eddie carries a revolver, a simple handgun. It's not a particularly powerful weapon in the context of the game. James's arsenal includes shotguns, rifles, and even a chainsaw by certain points. But the revolver is significant symbolically. It's a personal weapon, close range, the kind of gun used for self-defense or personal violence rather than military or hunting purposes. The fact that Eddie uses a revolver connects him to real-world violence. This isn't a fantasy weapon like the great knife that Pyramid Head drags around. It's the kind of gun someone could actually obtain, could actually use to kill people in the real world. This grounds Eddie's violence in reality in a way that the other horrors of Silent Hill aren't grounded. When Eddie points that gun at James, the threat feels different than when a nurse or a lying figure attacks. Those are monsters, manifestations, symbolic entities. Eddie is just a guy with a gun, and in some ways, that's more frightening because it's more plausible, more connected to real-world violence that happens every day. The revolver also has symbolic weight in terms of power dynamics. Throughout most of the game, James is the one with weapons, the one with power. He's armed and capable of defending himself against the monsters. But when Eddie pulls a gun on him, suddenly James is vulnerable. Suddenly the power dynamic has shifted, and James is facing the possibility of death at the hands of another human being, not a symbolic monster. This shift is crucial for breaking down James's denial. The monsters he's been killing are manifestations of his guilt, but they're easy to dehumanize. They're not human, so killing them doesn't carry moral weight in the same way. But Eddie is human, and killing him can't be rationalized away as easily. The prison setting for the final Eddie encounters is also deeply symbolic. Prisons represent punishment, confinement, and judgment. They're where society sends people who have committed crimes, where we isolate those we deem unfit for the community. By placing Eddie's arc in a prison, the game is making a statement about guilt and punishment. James descends into the prison by dropping through holes, going deeper and deeper underground. This descent mirrors the psychological journey he's on, going deeper into his own guilt, his own darkness, his own buried truths. The prison is literally beneath the surface level of Silent Hill, just as James's guilt is beneath the surface of his consciousness. The fact that there are graves in the prison, graves marked with the names of Angela, Eddie, and James, is one of the game's most powerful symbolic moments. These graves are empty, but they represent the spiritual death all three characters have experienced. They're dead in the ways that matter, dead to innocence, dead to peace, dead to normal life. They're walking corpses, going through the motions of living while being fundamentally destroyed by their guilt. The prison's oppressive atmosphere, its labyrinthine structure, its emphasis on descent and darkness. All of this creates a sense that this is the lowest point, the deepest part of hell that Silent Hill has to offer. And it's fitting that Eddie's final confrontation happens here, because Eddie represents the endpoint of unprocessed guilt and rage. He's gone as far down as someone can go while still being technically alive. When James emerges from the prison and takes a boat across the lake, it feels like crossing the river Styx, leaving the underworld behind. He's confronted the darkest truths, killed Eddie, and now he's being ferried toward the final revelation, the truth about what he did to Mary. The boat ride is quiet, contemplative, giving players time to process everything that's happened. And this is brilliant pacing. After the intensity of the prison section and the Eddie boss fight, the game gives you space to breathe, to think, to let the implications sink in. This is where the full weight of Eddie's role in the narrative becomes clear. He wasn't just a random encounter or a side story. He was essential preparation for the truth James is about to face. By forcing James to kill another human being, by making him experience the guilt of that act directly, Eddie has broken down the psychological barriers that were preventing James from remembering what he did to Mary. It's only after Eddie's death that James starts openly questioning his own timeline, his own memories, his own motives. Mary, did you really die 3 years ago? This question wouldn't have been possible before Eddie, because James was still too deeply in denial. But killing Eddie, saying out loud, "I killed a human being," has created a crack in that denial large enough for truth to seep through. This is narrative craftsmanship at its finest. Every element serves multiple purposes. Eddie is a character, a symbol, a mirror, a catalyst, and a warning all at once. His presence enriches the game thematically, emotionally, and psychologically. Let's examine what the remake of Silent Hill 2 did with Eddie's character and whether those changes enhanced or diminished his role. The 2024 remake by Bloober Team made several significant changes to Eddie's character and presentation. His visual design was updated. He looks more realistically proportioned, less like a caricature of obesity. This change was likely made to avoid insensitive depictions, but it also alters the character slightly. The original Eddie's exaggerated appearance emphasized how he was perceived by others and by himself, as grotesque, as other, as someone defined entirely by his body. The voice performance in the remake is different as well, bringing new interpretations to Eddie's lines. The original voice acting by David Schaffel was deliberately amateurish in places, which actually enhanced the character's pathetic, awkward quality. The remake's performance is more polished, more naturalistic, which makes Eddie feel more human and less like a symbolic figure. The cinematography in the remake is updated to modern standards, with dynamic cameras and more complex lighting. This creates atmosphere but loses some of the deliberate staging and framing of the original. The original game's fixed and semi-fixed camera angles were limitations that became strengths, creating specific compositions that guided player interpretation. The remake's more fluid camera is impressive technically, but sometimes loses that precise visual storytelling. However, the remake does preserve the essential elements of Eddie's arc, the progression from pathetic to sympathetic to threatening, the ambiguity about his guilt, the final confrontation that forces James to kill another person. The core function of the character remains intact. One change that some players noticed was the addition of more environmental storytelling around Eddie. The remake includes additional details in the rooms associated with him, more visual context for his backstory. This is in line with modern game design preferences for environmental narrative, but it also makes things slightly more explicit, reducing some of the ambiguity that made the original so effective. The pizza scene in the remake generated significant discussion among fans. Some felt the updated graphics and performance made it less absurd, and therefore less effective as a false security moment. Others felt the remake's version was actually more unsettling because Eddie's casual behavior feels more realistic and therefore more disturbing in context. The boss fight was significantly updated with new mechanics and a different arena layout. The original fight was often criticized for being mechanically weak, and the remake addresses this by making it more challenging and dynamic. However, some purists argue that the awkward, almost anticlimactic nature of the original fight was thematically appropriate. Eddie isn't a trained warrior or a supernatural threat. He's just a guy with a gun, and the fight reflecting that ordinariness was meaningful. These changes demonstrate the challenge of remaking a game as carefully constructed as Silent Hill 2. Every element was chosen deliberately, even elements that seem like flaws or limitations. When you update graphics, improve voice acting, modernize gameplay, you risk losing the specific qualities that made the original special. That said, the remake's Eddie is still effective. He still serves his narrative purpose, still challenges James and the player, still dies in a way that forces confrontation with uncomfortable truths. The character survives the translation to modern gaming sensibilities, even if something subtle is lost in the process. The fact that Eddie's character works across different presentations, original graphics, updated remake, different voice actors, speaks to the strength of the core concept. A well-written character can survive changes in execution because the fundamental ideas are solid. Now, let's address something crucial that we've been circling around. Why is Eddie specifically the most terrifying, rather than Angela or even James himself? Angela's story is more tragic. Her suffering is more unjust. The abuse she endured was more horrific. But Angela isn't terrifying. She's heartbreaking. You feel sympathy for her, pity, sorrow. You want to help her, to save her, to tell her it wasn't her fault. When she walks up that burning staircase, it's devastating, but it's not terrifying. It's sad. James himself is arguably more monstrous than Eddie. He killed someone who trusted him completely, who was vulnerable and sick, who had no ability to defend herself. Mary's murder is more cold-blooded, more calculated, more fundamentally wrong than Eddie's crimes. But James is the protagonist, and the game carefully controls how and when you learn about his crime. You discover it gradually, piece by piece, and you're positioned inside his head, seeing his rationalizations, experiencing his denial. This creates distance from the horror of what he did. Eddie, on the other hand, is presented from the outside. You're not in his head. You don't experience his justifications from a first-person perspective. You encounter him as James does, as another person separate from yourself. This creates the distance necessary for him to be truly frightening rather than pitiable or rationalizable. But more than that, Eddie is terrifying because of what he represents about the player's relationship to James. For most of the game, you assume you're playing as a sympathetic protagonist. You might notice things that seem off about James, but you're still fundamentally on his side, trusting his perspective, believing his stated motives. Eddie shatters that trust. When he tells James, "You and me are the same," it's a direct attack on your position as the player. You've been judging Eddie, seeing him as weak, suspicious, pathetic, dangerous. And now Eddie is saying that James, your avatar, your proxy in this world, is just like him, a murderer, someone the town called because of their guilt. This moment forces you to recontextualize everything. If James and Eddie are the same, then maybe James has been lying. Maybe his grief is performance. Maybe his search for Mary is delusion or denial. Maybe you've been playing as a villain all along, not a hero. That realization is terrifying because it's not about jump scares or grotesque imagery. It's about narrative betrayal, about having the rug pulled out from under your assumptions. It's the horror of realizing you've been complicit in something terrible, that you've been sympathizing with a murderer, that the game has been manipulating your perceptions all along. This is sophisticated horror that works on a metatextual level. It's not just James who's been in denial, it's you, the player. And Eddie is the character who breaks that denial, who forces you to see what you've been refusing to see. Angela can't do this because her role is different. She's there to show James and the player that some people are genuine victims, that not everyone in Silent Hill is equally guilty. She provides contrast. Maria can't do this because she's so obviously unreal, so clearly a manifestation or fantasy. She doesn't have the independent existence necessary to truly challenge James. Laura can't do this because she's a child and innocent, positioned outside the system of guilt and punishment entirely. Only Eddie can serve this function because only Eddie is positioned as similar enough to James to make the comparison meaningful, but separate enough to be truly confronted. He's another person, another killer, another guilty soul. And he recognizes James for what he is before James is ready to admit it. When Eddie dies and James processes what he's done, "I killed a human being," that moment works because Eddie has forced James into awareness. The defense of "it was self-defense" or "he was going to kill me" is immediately undercut by the recognition that those are the same justifications James has been making about Mary. She was suffering. It was mercy. She would have wanted this. Both killings are attempts to solve a problem through violence. Both are rationalized as necessary or justified, and both leave the killer changed, diminished, carrying a weight that can never be set down. This parallel is what makes Eddie's character so powerful and so terrifying. He's not just a mirror, he's a prophecy. He shows James what happens when you don't confront your guilt, when you let rage and denial take control, when you start seeing enemies everywhere and violence as the only answer. Eddie's fate is a warning. This is where you're headed if you don't wake up, and miraculously, it works. James does wake up. After killing Eddie, he's finally able to question his memories, his timeline, his motives. The final section of the game sees James progressively remembering the truth, piecing together what he did, until he finally confronts it fully in the videotape and hotel room. Without Eddie, this progression might not have been possible. James needed to kill someone, needed to feel that specific guilt, needed to have his denials thrown back in his face by someone who understood exactly what he was. This is why Eddie Dombrowski is the most terrifying character in Silent Hill 2. Not because he's the most violent or the most sympathetic, but because he's the one who sees through the lies, both James's lies and the player's willing acceptance of those lies. He's the truth teller, the mirror, the prophet of doom. He's the character who makes you realize that the real horror isn't in the fog or the monsters or even the other world. The real horror is inside James, and inside all of us who played as him, made his choices, pulled his triggers, and told ourselves we were the heroes of this story. Because in Silent Hill, everyone who arrives has been called there for a reason, and the town knows what you did, even if you don't want to remember. Eddie forces you to remember. He forces you to see, and that's more terrifying than any creature Team Silent could have designed. When you finish Silent Hill 2 and look back on Eddie's role in the narrative, you realize how carefully everything was constructed. His first appearance plants doubt. His second appearance eases that doubt. His third appearance confirms the worst. And his death catalyzes James' final transformation from denial to acceptance. Each encounter builds on the previous one, creating a character arc that's complete and meaningful despite limited screen time. Eddie appears in maybe 4 or 5 scenes total, but those scenes are so carefully written, so perfectly placed, and so thematically rich that he feels like a fully realized character. This is economical storytelling at its best. Every line of dialogue serves multiple purposes. Every camera angle communicates meaning. Every musical choice guides emotional response. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is arbitrary. And the result is a character who has haunted players for over 2 decades, who generates endless discussion and analysis, who stands as one of the most psychologically complex figures in gaming history. Eddie Dombrowski isn't just the most terrifying character in Silent Hill 2. He's one of the most terrifying characters in all of horror gaming, precisely because his horror isn't in how he looks or what he does. It's in what he reveals about the protagonist, about the player, about the nature of guilt and violence and the stories we tell ourselves to avoid facing uncomfortable truths. In a game filled with grotesque monsters and nightmarish environments, the most terrifying thing is another human being, broken and desperate and violent. Someone who looks at you and says, "We're the same," because what if he's right? What if the only difference between James Sunderland and Eddie Dombrowski is that James had a better excuse for his murder? What if the only difference between the player and these broken, guilty characters is that we've never been pushed to that edge, never been tested in ways that would reveal what we're capable of? These are the questions Eddie forces you to ask, and the absence of easy answers is what makes him truly terrifying. Silent Hill 2 understands that the deepest horror comes from recognition, from seeing yourself in the monster, from realizing that evil isn't some external force but a potential that lives inside everyone, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. Eddie is that recognition made flesh. He's the uncomfortable truth that victims can become perpetrators, that suffering doesn't excuse cruelty, that everyone has limits, and that those limits, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. He's the character who makes you question everything, and in a game about guilt, denial, and the psychological consequences of violence, that makes him the most important character in the entire narrative. More important than Pyramid Head, who's just a symbol. More important than Maria, who's just a fantasy. More important than even Mary, who exists mostly as memory and catalyst. Eddie is the key that unlocks James's ability to face the truth, And by extension, he's the key that unlocks the player's understanding of what this game is really about. Not a ghost story, not a monster hunt, but a psychological examination of what happens when we commit unforgivable acts and then have to live with ourselves afterward. Eddie failed that examination. He couldn't live with himself, so he turned his pain outward, creating more victims, more pain, more violence until someone stopped him. James has the opportunity to choose differently, to face what he did, to accept responsibility, to find some form of peace or at least understanding. Which ending you get depends on how you play, what choices you make, what you pay attention to. But all of the endings are only possible because Eddie forced James to confront the reality of killing another human being. In death, Eddie gives James what he couldn't give himself, clarity. And that's the final terrible irony of Eddie's character. He had to die so James could live. His failure enables James's potential redemption. His descent into violence and paranoia serves as the cautionary tale that allows James to choose a different path. Eddie is a sacrifice, whether he knew it or not a holy sacrifice, not a noble one, but a necessary one within the logic of Silent Hill's psychological landscape. He's the character who shows you what happens when you give up, when you stop fighting your demons and become them instead. And showing you that is perhaps the most valuable thing any horror character can do. Not just frighten you, but make you think, make you question, make you examine your own capacity for darkness. That's what makes Eddie Dombrowski the most terrifying character in Silent Hill. Not the monster in the fog, but the man in the mirror.